So, Richard here's a very last minute replacement here. We're due to have another speaker, so he's very kindly stepped in at the last moment and agreed to do a talk. I know I've seen a bit of this talk a couple of months ago at a different lecture that myself and Richard were speaking at, so it's going to be a very enjoyable evening, I'm sure. So, a little bit about Richard. He's a botanist, a horticulturist, and writer with a master's degree in biodiversity and taxonomy of plants. He previously worked at Kew and is currently the head of plant propagation at a very well-known nursery just outside Edinburgh called Kevick. I was actually on their website today, so if you want to have a look, you can just make it a bit more angry at what we can't get due to Brexit. It's a bit of a nightmare, but he's got a very keen interest in East Asia and has been involved in research of flora, excuse me, of the Myanmar region, and twice conducted field work in Vietnam as well. Like I said, he's a writer and he's a regular contributor for Curtis's botanical magazine, Trees and Shrubs Online, and numerous other horticultural journals and magazines and that. So if that wasn't enough to keep him busy, he's also currently leading a project at Kew Gardens as well, carrying out molecular work of the genus Aracema. So just a quick note as well that we'll do a little Q&A session at the end of this as well. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Richard there.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Colin. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you all tonight. I'll just share my screen with you. Well, thanks everyone for joining me tonight. I'm Richard Moore, and I'd like to take you on a journey to the Kanchenjunga Conservation Area, looking in particular at the incredible trees that inhabit this really wonderful place. So, first of all, I just have to acknowledge all the people who helped to make the trek happen. So, David and Stella Rankin, for inviting me on the trek. Two fantastic plants people. They started up the nursery that I'm currently working at, Kevick Garden Plants, and without them, I wouldn't have been able to go on the trip. The amazing guides and the porters who supported us every step of the way, absolutely amazing people, and to everyone else who joined the team, with whom we shared this experience. We're absolutely fantastic bunch of lovely people, and it's always so nice to be able to share the experience with others, and learn from each other along the way. Finally, to the Scottish Rhododendron Society, the Scottish Rock Garden Club, the Alpine Garden Society, the Colgrave Seabrook Foundation, and the Stanley Smith Horticultural Trust for their financial support. So, Nepal is a country that stretches around 800 kilometers from east to west. The region is home to 8 of the world's tallest mountains over the height of 8,000 meters, including Everest, of course, Sagarmatha, the world's tallest at 8,849 meters, and Kanchenjunga, the second tallest mountain in Nepal, and the third tallest mountain in the world at 8,586 meters. So this area in the northeast of the country was in 1998 designated as a conservation area, covering just over 2,000 kilometers squared, and it's therefore protected in order to preserve its unique landscapes and biodiversity. And this is the area that we went to. So here's Mount Kanchenjunga up on the right-hand side of the screen there, 8,586 meters tall. The name itself is actually derived from the Tibetan Kanchenjunga, which can be interpreted as the 5 treasures of the Great Snow. And for the local people, it's actually believed that a protected god lives at its peak, along with 5 treasures, hence the name. These treasures include sacred books, precious stones, invincible armor, salt, and medicine. And so no one is allowed to stand on its peak. So, as requested, Joe Brown and George Band, who made the first successful ascent of the mountain in 1955, respectfully stopped just short of the summit, and no one who's ever climbed it has ever stood on its peak. So, we landed in Kathmandu just over a year ago in October 2023. And we spent a couple of days there with our guides, visiting some of the famous temples around the city, and it was a good warm-up for the trek to come. And the next day, with our bags readied, we boarded this plane and flew over the hot and sticky town of Bhadrapur in the southeast of Nepal. Quite a nice flight with views out of the Himalayas as we went, although a bit of clouds obscuring them, unfortunately. But I mean, it when you look out over the clouds, even in a plane like this, you can see that the mountains are well, not much lower in altitude than we are in the air. It was pretty incredible. So from Bhadrapur, it was then a 2-day drive up into the mountains, and 2 very long days on some of the most unrelaxing roads imaginable, with every one of us clenched inside. Closer to the mountains, we had to change to new vehicles, something a bit more heavy duty due to the difficult terrain. And we were told by our guides that we'd learn a Nepalese dance. The dance, of course, consisted of us all being shaken to bits in the backs of the jeeps. So finally began our trek at a place called Sekatum. This was just over 1,500 meters in altitude. And we'd then hike north along the Ghunsa River all the way up eventually until Pangpema base camp for views of the north face of Kanchenjunga. We'd then go back down the same route and then across into the next valley, across the Selele Pass, and then up again to see the south face of Kanchenjunga before retreating back down the mountains. And along the way, we'd encounter tropical woodlands, temperate montane forest, alpine scrub and high alpine meadows. It's just an incredibly diverse flora owing to the dramatic topography and climatic conditions. So our first stop was Sekatum, small settlement at the base of, well, what's really the greater Himalayas. And it was here that we met our porters for the trek. So from left to right, sorry, we have Lakpa Sherpa, the leader of the group. Next to him, Pemba, and Lakpa again in the middle. Renzin Sherpa, Dawa Sherpa, and Ramesh Sherpa. 6 amazing people. They did the whole trek in nothing more but sandals, carrying 2 bags each, far much than any of us could carry. And well, we couldn't have done it without them. So the trek began through a beautiful gorge following the Ghunsa River, starting at an altitude of just under 1,600 meters. The subtropical vegetation included bananas. Sadly, these ones weren't ripe. A plethora of orchids. This is a minute lithophytic dendrobium, and many begonias. This is lovely begonia picta. We came across a lovely clematis conata. On the left there, agapetes, serpens, which was in almost every tree at this altitude. Lovely ericaceous plant. And the dainty Utricularia camalnensis on the right-hand side, which covered the moist river-splashed rocks all along the trail, just like jewels along the walk. It was beautiful. And one of the most beautiful lower altitude trees we saw here was Erythrina arborescens. This is a member of the legume family, believe it or not, with these bright red orange flowers, and later producing these bean-like fruits, very, very clearly a legume when you see the fruits. And one of the most widespread subtropical species found here, and indeed across the Himalayas and continental Southeast Asia, is something called Sorauia napolensis. It's got these very distinctly veined, attractive leaves and nice pink flowers as well, quite small. The genus name Sorauia is actually named after an Austrian politician, Count Franz Joseph von Sarau. And this is another tree we came across at relatively low altitudes. I first thought this was some kind of terra carrier with these, these long hanging racemes of winged nut-like fruits. It's actually a very close relative in the same family, the Jugulandaceae family, called Engelhardia spicata. Really lovely tree, very elegant. And I think this was one that took us by surprise. This was one of the most interesting plants we saw in lower altitudes. High up in the trees, we noticed these red flowers, and we couldn't work out what they were from. It was later we realized that this flowering plant was actually parasitizing the tree that it was on. This is Scurrilla elata, and I found this flower that dropped to the ground so I could have a closer look. Very interesting plant in the Loranthaceae family. So there was a huge number of ericaceous species in the area. It's a lovely Vaccinium Gaultheriifolium. Top right is Gaultheria fragrantissima in fruit. And on the bottom is the tree Lionia ovalifolia, which even when not in flower has wonderful bark once they reach a good age. The first rhododendron we found was Rhododendron arboreum, and as common as they are, it's always very exciting to see these species that we know so well from horticulture in the wild for the first time. For me, the first time seeing this, and that was wonderful. And the river was loud and ferocious. Either side, you can see a huge diversity of tree species. And on the bottom right here, you can see Ulmus nepalensis, a very distinctive tree with leathery leaves and often bearing young or old cone-like fruits. They tend to hang on to them for quite a while, and male catkins, as you can see here. And in the same area, we also came across the Himalayan hornbeam, Carpinus feminea, really huge specimens. I didn't expect them to be so large, and but beautiful trees bearing lovely slender pointed leaves, the typical clusters of fruit with the large bracts on them as well. Very, very nice tree. I haven't seen this in cultivation, but I assume it's possibly hardy enough in some regions. So after a 16-kilometer hike, the first day of the trek, we reached Amgelosa Camp at 2,400 meters, and there was a lovely small group of Pinus wallichiana here. Now at almost 2,500 meters up, we began checking our blood O2 levels every evening. Our guides were really, they were great. They were, of course, very concerned about our health and safety throughout the trip, and making sure we were all coping well with the altitudes. General advice is to only climb about 500 meters in altitude per day, although due to the nature of the area we're in, the Kanchenjunga Conservation Area only has a few different settlements that you're able to stop at, really, and much further than 500 meters in altitude in between them. So it's really important to check our O2 levels along the way. I didn't sleep particularly well. We had really heavy rain for most of that night, but we continued up the Ghunsa River the next day and up to the next settlement of Gyabla at an altitude of 2,700 meters. The next morning, the trails looked beautiful and lush. The views down the valley were wonderful as we ascended, and already the vegetation was beginning to change, becoming much more temperate. We came across some familiar faces, such as Sarcococca hercuriana on the left there, and lots of new plants we'd never seen before, such as this exquisite Lobelia seguinii, beautiful flowers, and Rubus nepalensis, the Nepalese bramble, which also had some very, very delicious fruits on it that we could enjoy along the way. At around 2,500 meters, we saw our first specimen of Rhododendron lepidotum, although I didn't realize at the time how variable this species is in the wild, and I wasn't sure of its identity at this point. No flowers, of course, but you'll see later on just how variable this species is. The oaks were absolutely magnificent, gigantic specimens, and just like our own oaks, providing a host for many other epiphytic species, and I'm sure many insects as well. This is Quercus semicarpifolia, with very leathery leaves, slightly pointed towards the tips, slightly with yeah, slight sort of serrations. And I mean, on these oaks, even the hardy ginger Pidicium spicatum could be found growing on their enormous branches. And this is another oak, I think Quercus acutissima, although it's difficult to confidently identify without the fruit. But another beautiful oak with much thinner, more elegant leaves, and again, serrated margins there. So, as well as a whole range of other interesting plants, we found Aconitum hemsleyanum, a beautiful deep red form, Codenopsis gracilis, the bottom left there, and Edgeworthia gardneri in bud. Beautiful in bud, but sadly we were a bit too early to see it in flower. It would have beautiful yellow, heavily scented flowers when it opens. And this is in cultivation, or it's not quite hardy. I know that Krug Farm in Wales has some plants of this, but it's not quite hardy enough to grow outside. So there was also quite a diversity of Xanthoxylum, a genus famous for its use as a spice, and this is where Sichuan pepper comes from. The smell of the fruits is, of course, wonderful, and although I didn't fancy handling the one in the top left-hand corner there, they're also very, very spiny. So that's Xanthoxylum acanthopodium. The bottom left is Oxyphilum, and there was a range of others. Quite difficult to identify some of them, but they were all covered in fruits at this time of year. So still close to the river, many more temperate tree species became more frequent. This is a lovely Aesocanth bellii growing out over the rapids below. And as we got further up, the distinct rhododendron arboreums, but subspecies Cinnamomum appeared. What I found interesting was this form with the rusty coloured undersides to the leaves. This form all seems to be at higher altitudes, whereas the paler form seemed to be at lower altitudes. But the size of these trees was incredible. The picture on the right-hand side there, I'm actually standing on the trunk of this rhododendron, which was growing vertically out over almost a vertical drop. So I was pretty careful about standing there. Didn't stay for too long, but just looking up through these rhododendrons was fantastic. Just the sun shining through the leaves, absolutely beautiful. And this is another oak we came across, Quercus oxyodon. Huge trees again, and this was the only species we saw bearing fruit actually. And it's so it's one of the ringed cupuled oaks. Huge trunks on them, just amazing, and as I say, so many epiphytic plants growing upon them as well. So one plant I was particularly interested in seeing in the wild was Corylus ferox, the Himalayan hazelnut. I've written an account of Corylus for trees and shrubs online, and I think this is one of the most interesting species of the genus, with these amazingly spiny fruits. Unfortunately, we actually found no specimens in fruit, although I thought it would be the right time of year when we were there. Fortunately, at Edinburgh Botanics, there are some nice mature specimens, and this is a picture on the right-hand side from a couple of years ago. But they did have the male catkins were forming. we noticed that many of these corylus, many of these hazels had been coppiced purposefully so that they produce lower branching for fodder for animals, for livestock. So after a lovely hike, again around 14 kilometers that day, we made it to Gyabla at 2,700 meters. So not too much of a climb that day. But Gyabla was just the most lovely place, a very scenic little hamlet, very peaceful, stunning views down the valley. And well, it was just the kind of place you could sit and admire for hours. The distinctive canopies of the conifer Tsuga Damosa silhouetted across the distant ridges over there, and this stunning waterfall. It was just, yeah, it was like a postcard. Absolutely beautiful place. The next morning, our porters readied themselves. Here they are with all our bags. They always headed off first, and we followed slowly behind. And it was this morning that we got our first view of the imposing, jagged, snow-dusted peaks beyond. It was so not so long into the hike, around 3,000 meters up. The iconic Betula utilis made itself known to us. At first, with just glimpses of the red bark appearing to glow through the forests, the sunlight really catches them beautifully. And of course, it's named utilis, literally meaning useful, as it's used for such a variety of things by the local Nepalese and Tibetan people, for fuel, construction, fodder for animals, medicine. They use the bark for paper, for writing. And our guides also told us that the local people use the bark to make waterproof coats and clothing. And it suddenly felt much more temperate. It's much cooler. And beneath the trees was a wonderful variety of plants. This was an amazing gentian relative on the left-hand side called Helenia elliptica, almost berberis-like flowers. It was a lovely thing to find. And this in the middle is a lovely orchid, Satyrium nepali ciliatum. This is an orchid that's also used by the local people. They eat the tuber. There's a potato-like tuber on it, which is edible. And in the undergrowth, we found a single plant of Paris polyphylla. Beautiful plant, but it's sad just to see the one. It's now extremely rare in the wild, unfortunately, due to overcollecting for medicinal use, fetching very high prices on the market. And well, along the paths, Daphne bolua, quite a sought after shrub in the UK and Ireland, is well, it's almost a weed here, just growing very commonly along the trails. We saw this amazing specimen of Vaccinium nummularia in the middle, just hanging from a moist rock face. And again, more lovely specimens of Betula utilis. This is a very old one on the right-hand side, completely covered by moss. And you can see the male catkins, again, just starting to form at the end of the branch there. So as we neared the town of Ghunsa, we entered this beautiful sacred area marked with prayer flags and met with this marvelous old Juniperus recurva. This natural hollow just had the most amazing atmosphere. And you have to wonder, when you come across trees like this, whether the likes of Joseph Hooker once stood here admiring this ancient tree. It was very likely that he took the very same steps as we did, the same route up here, and just, well, incredible place. Beautiful foliage on Juniperus recurva, very elegantly drooping, and it's got some fruits on it here as well, typical juniper fruits. Looking down the valleys at this point in the trek, you could really see how dominant the conifers were becoming. Once you reach around 3,000 meters, really the dominant forest tree. This is another conifer, Tsuga damosa, the Himalayan hemlock, one of the most conifers, one of the most common conifers in the region, and quite distinctive at a distance, as the trees have tiered, slightly drooping branches. The leaves are pointed and spirally arranged. Also, they're not on a single plane, as are most of the other conifers, and the cones are quite unique amongst the other conifers of the area as well. And some more conifers, Abies spectabilis on the right, and the bottom, sorry, on the left, on the bottom right, the Himalayan fir, and in the middle and the top right is Larix griffithii with its narrow oblong cones. And you can clearly see the differently shaped crowns of these conifers in areas like this, allowing you to identify them from quite a distance. So on the right here is Abies spectabilis, and on the left there is Larix griffithii. Really easy to distinguish, and even between the more similar species, between the Abies and the Tsuga, for example, from quite a distance you can tell the difference. So as we gained elevation, the number of rhododendron species rose quickly. This is rhododendron thomsonii making an appearance with its rounded foliage, the occasional old flower stem with the very distinct cup-like calyces still attached, the lovely reddish-brown smooth bark. It's great seeing them all growing together. There's a mixture of rhododendron arboreum and thomsonii in this picture. And after a 10-kilometer hike, we approached Ghunsa, the town of Ghunsa, at 3,400 meters. Thankfully, we found the right bridge across the river, unlike this rather confused and stubborn goat who obviously took a wrong turn, but he was adamant that this was the right way to go, bleating as if his owner could, would come back to collect him. But, well, eventually the owner just gave up, I think, and went back to the town. So I don't know how long the goat stayed there for, but anyway, we got a good rest. And well, Ghunsa is well, it's the town. It's you walk in there and it's like taking a step back in time, literally. The beach hut style accommodation was rather nice actually, and there was a toasty warm log burner in the dining hut, which was much appreciated. But just the most beautiful place. I'm sure, it's just as it's always been, really. This lovely prayer wheel here, and yeah, beautiful, peaceful place. The farm animals. So the next day we were supposed to have a rest to acclimatize to the altitude, and well, to regather our strength. But we decided to hike up one of the nearby peaks. Fortunately, not this one in the picture. And well, across the mountainside, we came across our first Edelweiss, Leontopodium jacotianum, and a tapestry of other alpine shrubs covering the mountainsides, a few different rhododendron species. But growing on the slopes were some magnificent junipers, and this is a huge Juniperus indica with exquisite rusty brown exfoliating bark, covered in epiphytes again. The foliage is more upright and stiffer in appearance to Juniperus recurva. But now, what confused me is, according to their description, Juniperus indica is a small shrub, only to around 2 meters in height. Although, besides the difference in size between the trees and the dwarf ones at higher altitudes, these are very, very similar in regards to the foliage and the fruits. And even more confusingly, the only tree-sized junipers recorded from this area are Juniperus recurva and Juniperus communis, which are both distinctly different to this. So it seems like there's still quite a bit of confusion about the junipers in this region. But I'm assuming this is just a very, very large and very, very old Juniperus indica. Nonetheless, it's certainly a juniper, and it's a beautiful tree. They were just absolutely wonderful. Again, more junipers dotted across the mountainside. They were just amazing. And on the right-hand side is a huge trunk of a Tsuga damosa, Himalayan hemlock. Later on that day, we had some time to ourselves, and after a quick lie down, I had a wander around the outskirts of the village, where I discovered a magical little area, home to a variety of rhododendron species, all in one place. So on the left is Rhododendron setosum, in the middle is Rhododendron lepidotum, and on the right is Anthropogon, with these strange sort of tissue paper-like flowers. Further on, I also found Rhododendron cinnabarinum on the left-hand side, and Rhododendron wallichii, very attractive indementum. So this area was absolutely magical. Icy cold glacial streams glowing with white sand below, which had been washed down from the mountains above, and just an incredible diversity of plants. But you could quite imagine someone trying to recreate this in one of their gardens, you know, here, and just had such a lovely atmosphere to it. So the next day, we made our way to the next camp of Kanchenjunga. At this altitude, the forests are mainly comprised of a number of conifers. This is on the left, Larix griffithii, lovely specimen with some good fruits on it there. There was many Tsuga damosas, betulas, and on the right-hand side is Abies spectabilis, a beautiful old specimen there. The trunk charred. I assume it had possibly been struck by lightning in the past, but still, you know, still growing away. The Abies in particular just seem to be very, very, you know, long-lived, very, very tough, robust trees, often with quite a few dead branches at the top. They're looking, you know, really quite gnarled, and you know, but still in good health, I think. The specimens of Betula utilis just got better and better. There were some truly extraordinary trees here. Unlike our native birches, these are clearly capable of reaching a much greater age. But I've never seen a Betula utilis, you know, quite like this. They were just wonderful. You know, it's difficult to pin an age on a tree like this, but they've got to be at least a couple of 100 years old. So some of the woodland areas were just magical. Lichens hanging from the branches, and a spectacular mixture of conifers and deciduous trees, creating a lovely mixture of colours and textures. And you know, we had beautiful dapple shade. And there were some really lovely specimens of sorbus here, starting to show their autumn colour. Although, curiously, actually, throughout the whole trip, we saw very, very few bearing any fruit. The majority had no berries at all. We found one here with some good berries on it. This is Sorbus microphylla. It's well, the genus is confusing at the best of times, but this one at least was relatively easy to identify. And it wasn't long until we got first sight of the glaciers. This is the terminal moraine of the Janu Glacier on our way up the Ghunsa River, and you know, it'd be a couple more days until we get sight of Mount Kanchenjunga. On our way to the moraine, we came across another very interesting shrub. I think one of the most interesting of the trip for me was this hippophae, as miniature sea buckthorn, Hippophae tibetana. which is recorded as being one of the highest growing woody plants known, having been recorded up to altitudes of 5,200 meters. Very nice dwarf compact shrub with the typical orange sea buckthorn berries. I didn't try one actually. I wish I'd had, but you know, I've never actually seen this plant in cultivation, but it's certainly hardy enough. Yeah, a very, very nice plant. And just before hitting the moraine, looming in front of us were some more lovely specimens of Abies spectabilis. This time bearing their attractive blue-grey oblong cones, exuding very sticky sap. Really beautiful trees. So it was then to traverse the terminal moraine of the January Glacier. As we made a start up the rocky slopes, I noticed this lone Betula utilis, which was actually the last one we saw up at this altitude. This was at just around 4,000 meters. And it was actually the last of the taller trees we'd see. Right on, you know, this was, I suppose, you know, the very limit of these taller woody trees. And from here on, nothing grew more than 1 meter or 2 in height at the most. So, well, going across the moraine, to put it in one word, was pretty bleak. The thick fog was setting in, and the air was becoming bitterly cold. But you know, despite that, the flora was just as interesting as ever. There was clumps of Cassiope fastigiata dotted across the slopes, lots of dwarf rhododendrons. This is Setosum, pictured there in flower, and the lovely autumn colours of this dwarf salix behind. So yeah, lovely mixture of things. And once over the moraine, we came to a grazed alpine meadow, absolutely covered with jewel-like Gentian ornata. And by chance, after investigating an interesting bank just beside one of the icy streams exiting the glacier, I spotted some specimens of Gentiana depressa growing completely vertically out of this bank, covered by Cotoneaster microphylla. So a very welcome reward for surpassing the moraine. We'd covered around 15 kilometers that day, and we'd climbed over 600 meters in altitude to just over 4,000 meters. But when we arrived at the cabin, I mean, we only got first sight of the cabin when we got within just a few meters of it. The fog was so thick. And when we woke up and looked outside the next day, that's when we realized what we'd missed, as we were surrounded by the most glorious snow-capped peaks, backed by a fresh blue sky. It was quite a surprise, quite a shock, a very welcome surprise in the morning. The landscape was becoming more extreme and inhospitable with every step, but all the more spectacular as well. Just incredible landscapes. The scale of the place is difficult to put into words, really. As we passed through the alpine meadows, some areas were covered with clumps of Cynopodophyllum hexandrum, a plant that I'd up until then assumed inhabited woodland areas, but it was here growing in full sun at over 4,000 meters in altitude. Beside it were the unmistakable seed heads of Mechanopsis grandis. And by this point, Gentiana ornata was so abundant that we were almost having to avoid stepping on it. In the sheltered channels created by glaciation, you can see, you know, all of these this mixture of shrubs growing just, you know, out of the hungered down out of the elements as much as they can be. A mixture of willows, junipers, rhododendrons, and Dasyphora fruticosa, commonly known as Potentilla fruticosa, becoming very, very common in these areas. The valleys were just, well, amazing, carved out by glacial ice and creating these stunning valleys. And of course, despite the altitude, there was animal life to be seen as well. We were lucky enough to spot a number of herds of blue sheep on the nearby slopes. Not as blue as the name suggests, but beautiful, beautiful animals, these very distinctive horns. Eventually, after a long day's hike across difficult rocky terrain and a number of landslide areas that we had to be quite careful of, we reached the terminal moraine of the Kanchenjunga Glacier. The juniper, dwarf juniper, Juniperus indica, was one of the dominant shrubs in this area. You can see it all across the landscape here. This is just under 4,700 meters in altitude, and sitting just beside it is Dasyphora fruticosa, one of the most common shrubs at these altitudes as well. Then, I mean, this is a site I've always dreamt of seeing. This is a glacier. This is the glacier of the Kanchenjunga Valley. Not white as you'd perhaps imagine, but actually covered with debris from constant rockfalls from the mountains either side. It's a site that I'll never forget. Just incredible. The pool of icy cold water at the base from where the Ghunsa River starts its journey. And well, as we walked along the glacier, you'd hear the odd, the occasional creak as it slowly makes its way along. We're almost at our next camp of Lonak, and yet again, numerous new species appeared before us after crossing one of the streams from the glacier. On this rocky slope here, we came across clumps of Saxifraga and Andersonii, identifiable by the seed heads that were still attached, and this lovely asteroid in flower, Alardia glabra. Surprised again to see these things in flower at this time of year and at such high altitudes. So we at last arrived at Lonak, probably the most miserable place to stay of the whole trip, apart from the incredible scenery surrounding. I'm probably exaggerating at this point because I was really suffering from a splitting headache at this point. The altitude was pretty tough. But it was a lovely place to stay. I mean, the scenery was you can't really complain with this, the scenery like that. Although the wood burning stoves powered by yak dung were a bit of a disappointment. They were barely warm enough to dry a damp tissue, but I had a good sleeping bag with me, so I didn't get too cold. They're just some of the most dramatic landscapes I've ever seen. It was like entering the lands of Mordor. Half expected Gollum to come, climbing around the corner or something. Just amazing place. And the next morning was the day that we'd set off to go and see the north face of Mount Kanchenjunga. So we were quite worried because we set off and it was thick fog to begin with. But we saw these blue sheep in the distance, beautiful, very dramatic silhouettes of the blue sheep in the distance. But eventually the fog began to clear and we could look down upon the glacier. Just incredible to see. I didn't want to get too close to the edge, of course, but many interesting plants as well, just growing right on the edge there. The substrate here is essentially granitic sand, very fine, with large areas of scree and larger lumps of granite providing some protection for some other plants as well. And we saw this beautiful golden edelweiss, Leontopodium monocephalum, literally growing on the very edge of the glacier. Just an incredible plant, perfectly adapted to the harsh environment as well, just hunkered down. One of the most beautiful alpine plants I've ever seen, I think. And as we skirted the Kanchenjunga Glacier, we just had these dramatic peaks, everywhere we looked. This is a peak called Wedge Peak, Chang Kemal, which rises to a height of 6,802 meters. It's pretty much unclimbable, as it's really as thin as a knife's edge at its top, and from the bottom we could see shards of ice forming on the summit. Pretty amazing. As we continued, the great Mount Kanchenjunga remained still hiding from view, and by this point we were sure that we were quite near the base camp. But our guides actually called it the Shy Mountain, because it's only until you get right to the base camp itself that it reveals itself. It stays hidden, for as long as possible. And well, eventually we made it there, and it was an absolutely amazing sight. Once thought to be the highest mountain in the world, actually, before Mount Everest was accurately measured. Just to give you a sense of scale and the height of the mountain, from where I'm stood there at just over 5,000 meters in altitude, it's another 3,400 meters to the summit, which just gives you all new admiration for whoever even attempts to climb a mountain like that. Besides it are the twin peaks, Gimikela Chuli, the tallest of which is 7,350 meters. And literally just the other side of these peaks is Sikkim. And this is the team at Pingpama Base Camp. And left to right is Dorche, one of our guides, Helen, Lawrence, Chris, Renzen, Stella, David, myself, Edward, and Pemba Sherpa on the right-hand side. And Lokendra was another one of our guides who was taking the photograph there. And just a quick time-lapse video. I mean, we stayed for some time here, having spent all of that time and energy climbing up to a vantage point like this. We didn't want to head straight back down, of course. It was, well, an awe-inspiring place. And well, it was then time to head back down. But along the way, of course, we spotted many other things, such as this beautiful Mechanopsis horridula in fruit, a species I'd long wanted to see after reading about it in Kingdom Awards books. This is a Dasyphora fruticosa in the middle, almost black in color. But again, these were all growing at just over 5,000 meters in altitude, and a very, very dwarf form of rhododendron anthropogon, which again was growing very happily up at these altitudes. After a final night at Lonak, we headed all the way back down to Ghunsa, trekking 22.5 kilometers. It was a very hard day's hike. Thankfully going downhill, of course, but it was very heavy going on the knees. But we had amazing weather all the way down. These gentians, there's the Janu Peak in the background, the sacred peak for the Nepalese people, just making for a beautiful photograph. And on the way back down, we spotted a rhododendron cinnabrinum in flower, which we'd completely missed on the way up. So it was nice to catch that beautiful soft red flowers. So once back at Ghunsa, we now felt rather comfortable with the altitudes, having acclimatized, and we then prepared for our final leg of the trek, over taking the Selele Pass over to the next valley and then up to see the south face of Kanchenjunga. So we walked up through woodlands of rhododendron and maple. This is Acer pectinatum, a beautiful maple with hanging clusters of pink samaras and the leaves turning yellow for the autumn as well. Very, very nice tree. It's also in cultivation in Europe, so it's one well worth growing. And we were met by incredible coniferous forests again. You can see here the larches, interestingly, were inhabiting the riverbanks. And then as you get further in, you see the larger Abies spectabilis forming the dominant forest cover, beneath which was mainly rhododendron and birch. You can see the rhododendron down at the bottom there, the birch at the top, and the Abies spectabilis just further beyond. The groves of rhododendron hodgsonii were beautiful, very distinct, smooth pine, pink bark, and they were just, they really stood out in these forests. They were the only, they were pretty much the only woody plants that weren't covered in lichens and mosses. I suppose because they exfoliate their bark after some time, but it's they're almost glowing and very distinct large leaves with this pale intermentum. As we climbed, once again, the conifers withdrew, making way for other species such as Sorbus microphylla in its full autumn colour, which was just beautiful, and these brilliant snowy peaks beyond, making for a pretty unbeatable backdrop. The slopes of the mountains again were covered with a spectacular collage of plants showing their autumnal hues, of oranges, reds, mixtures of rhododendrons, and there's these reds and pinks of persicaria as well running through. And as we approached the first ridge, we spotted a familiar face, Beginia purpurascens. As you'll all know that from being in cultivation here, and some more unusual plants. This is Cynanthus pedunculatus, poking its head out along the ridges, and another rhododendron lepidotum in flower. The landscapes were pretty extreme, and at a distance they look very, very barren and sort of devoid of life. But as soon as you start having a closer look, you realize just how rich and diverse they are. We arrived at the Cellular Guest House at just under 4,300 meters in altitude, and it would be the day after that we would cross the rest of the pass. Pretty high altitude all day, it was at this point that once we'd gotten to the guest house that the altitude must have gotten to me a bit, because I decided to have a quick paddle in this beautiful tranquil stream. I took my shoes and socks off, rolled my trousers up, and this beautiful, I couldn't resist this beautiful water. It was it was very, very cold, as you can imagine. It was certainly refreshing. But I'd have regretted it if I didn't. And we slept very well actually, and the next day attempted to cover the rest of the Cellular Pass through some of the most dramatic scenery we'd yet encountered. Tundra-like environment with very few woody species able to survive here. The tufts of growth you can see are pretty much entirely dwarf rhododendron anthropogon and Dasyphora fruticosa. So over the day, we journeyed over 3 high passes: the Cellular, 4,620 meters, the Merginla, 4,642 meters, and the Sinalapchala at 4,708 meters, before quickly descending 800 meters straight down to the small settlement of Teram. And it was this place that this is one of the passes that Hooker passed through when he was there, and it was here that he was thought to have made what's thought to be the earliest record of Mount Everest by a European, from the Merginla, one of the second pass that we made. Although the weather, unfortunately, wasn't on our side. It was a good job it wasn't cloudy when Hooker visited, but nonetheless, an incredible landscape. Throughout the day, we came across some of the most iconic alpine plants, which was an absolute treat. This is Sausoria gossipifera, just wonderful, with the flowers almost completely enveloped by candyfloss-like hairs. And another very, very interesting alpine that I'd not come across before, cushion-forming umbellifer, yellow hookeri, named after Joseph Hooker, of course. And this is it in full flower, no higher than 2 or 3 centimeters off the ground, absolutely flat to the ground, really. And a beautiful plant. pretty much impossible to grow in cultivation. Just the conditions are so so particular here. And reaching the end of the Cellular Pass and looking down on the Yalin Glacier was quite a sight. The next day, we'd be skirting the edge of the glacier to see the south face of Kanchenjunga. So we headed straight down to Tseram, which is down to 3,900 meters. And at this point, we really needed to give our feet a good rest. We regrouped and the next morning made our way towards the Yalin Glacier. The landscape again was very barren, and with such a long hike ahead of us, to be honest, we just kept our heads down and went for it. The plant life was pretty undiverse actually in this area, mainly dwarf junipers, rhododendron, anathopogon, and Dasyphora fruticosa, and a few gentians mixed in for good measure along the way. One of the camps we passed had utilised a novel form of insulation made from yak bats. I'm sure it probably works quite well as long as the smell doesn't linger for too long. I thought that was quite interesting. And we eventually neared Oktang Base Camp, from where we'd get views of the south face of Mount Kanchenjunga, again along this incredible glacier. Our guides were very, very careful and telling us not to get too close to the edge. They didn't really want to get the helicopters out to come and save us. But eventually we made it, and thankfully before heavier clouds rolled in, actually we were just in time to catch glimpses of the peak of Mount Kanchenjunga. It was interesting that whilst here there was a small there was the Tibetan prayer flags up and a small shrine there, and our guides our guides started collecting rhododendron anthropogon to burn for incense. Actually, it's it has many uses. It has a number of medicinal uses, but it's also also it's valued for it's a sacred plant for the Nepalese, and as I say, it's commonly burnt for incense. It's a I'd never come across this species before, but it has a really amazing scent. It's got quite a medicinal, sweet scent to it if you break the branches, and very, very strong aroma to it. So it was then time to head back down the mountains, and having seen both faces of Nepal's second tallest mountain was pretty incredible. On the way back down, we followed the Simbu-Akola river, which on the way down we crossed some of the richest temperate forests of the trip. I was very happy to see Prunus rufa in the wild with the exquisite bronze peeling bark. And the specimens were just fantastic, very, very rugged in appearance. Again, that amazing peeling bark glowing with the sun shining through it. And you'd think, well, at first glance, actually, quite easy to confuse with Betula utilis, although the leaves are relatively easy to tell apart from each other. This is Prunus rufa on the left-hand side, with more heavily serrated leaves, and you tend to get this pink-coloured petiole. The Betula utilis on the right-hand side has a cordate, heart-shaped base to the leaf, and generally fewer serrations and slightly different veination as well. Both beautiful trees. And talking of birches, this has to be one of my favourite trees of the trek. This very, very old Betula utilis, which was growing almost horizontally out from the mountainside. By far the biggest birch I've seen, and I run up this hillside to get a closer look at it. Just amazing tree. We continued through forests that looked, just like something you'd read in Lord of the Rings, and just beautiful coniferous forests along the way. Abies spectabilis and Tsugudamosa in the distance. there was a good diversity of rhododendrons down the valley. Lovely specimen of rhododendron fulgens with its felt-like orange indumentum. Below which around which, were growing Hydrangea heteromala, and there's another rhododendron thomsonii here on the right-hand side. Rhododendron barbatum with the telltale barbs on the petioles. Large, huge trees. These were fantastic specimens. And rather confusingly, rhododendron barbatum without any barbs on the petioles. And some very interesting forms of rhododendron arboreum on the left there, and at the bottom a very, very dark-leaved form, quite young, but I'm be very interested to see what that's, how that particular plant matures and whether it retains that colour. And at the top there is a lovely Viburnum nervosum, turning a beautiful deep purple colour in the autumn. We stopped one night on the way back down at a small settlement called Tortong, surrounded by these majestic Acer campbellii trees, covered in fruit. And in the afternoon sun, they were just glowing this glorious pink colour, almost haloed by these fruits that were hanging from the branches. Beautiful trees. The forests were incredible, and with the river roaring through its centre, and beneath all the trees were, of course, a plethora of beautiful plants as well. Tricertis maculata, with Nepal is actually the most westerly distribution of the genus. Crawfordia speciosa, beautiful gentian relative, climbing in the shrubs around us, and Codonopsis viridis as well, another climbing plant. As we went, we came across wonderful groves of rhododendron falconeri as well, which we'd not seen previously. It was very interesting to see how these different rhododendron species were separated. As I say, we hadn't seen this one anywhere else, and almost every area we went to, we'd see something slightly different. But impressive enough without the flowers. Just magnificent foliage. The leaves are quite beautiful. And as we lowered in altitude, the temperature and humidity, of course, rose. The subtropical vegetation started to set in, and we could begin to see more signs of civilization across the mountainsides. But it was not long before the trek came to an end at the town of Helok, and just before that, we found this beautifully scented specimen of Magnolia chisopa in flower. A lovely thing to find at the end of a hard day's hike back down the mountain. The real stars of the trek, I have to say, were our three amazing guides. This is on the left, Renzen, in the middle, Lokendra, and on the right, Dorche. And well, they kept us smiling. They kept us laughing the whole way. They looked after us. They were absolutely fantastic. They kept us in good spirits, and very, very, very nice people. And of course, all of the porters who carried our bags, as I said at the start, we couldn't have done it without them. So we trekked back down to the town of Helok, down to 1,500 meters. We got into the jeeps and headed back home. Well, for the rest of the team, they headed home, but I had further work to do, so I actually flew straight off to Vietnam after that. Fortunately, I did give myself a few days rest in between, but yeah, it was well, to be honest, I could have done with going home at that point. I was knackered. In total, we covered 170 kilometers on foot. We climbed 3,640 meters in altitude, from 1,533 meters to a maximum altitude of 5,173 over the course of 12 days. And again, it was a real pleasure to be alongside such a wonderful team of people with whom to enjoy it, each learning from each other along the way, and to be guided by the most lovely people throughout the trek. Thank you very much.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for that. Geez, that was gets the juices going for going on another trip, doesn't it? That's now that looks like an absolutely amazing trip. And I know that you went out to Vietnam on another botanical expedition after that. So we'll have to have you back to hear about that. But it was yeah, it was very good to see the outstanding variety of the plants, the scenery, and the altitude, and as you went up, how everything changed going through it. But the I think that couple of days either side of was at Kanchenjunga, the woodland scenery out there. That was absolutely amazing to see. I have to that's interest to me because I'm trying to create something similar like that at Salter Bridge here. So
yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, I have many more photographs I can share with you there.
Well, you can feel free to send them on to me. Like they were absolutely spectacular. So, yeah, no, I just want to say again, thank you very much for taking us on the journey with you this evening. And just want to put it out, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask Richard there.
Richard, thank you very much. Certainly a lot of plants that we've seen on the other side of Kanchenjunga, but absolutely fantastic scenery. Well done.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Great pictures, Richard, and a wealth of colour. The plants are amazing. Unbelievable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It was, as I say, it was an amazing experience. I feel extremely grateful to be able to, to go to places like this, and to be able to share it, with all of you as well. It's just, yeah, you learn so much from seeing all of these things growing in the wild, whether it's just about wanting to grow them yourself in your own garden back home, but or just learning about how all of these plants actually grow, in the wild in these landscapes, and what kind of conditions they grow in. The whole kind of ecology to me is I find absolutely fascinating, and how these things grow together. But yeah, it was amazing.
Just a quick question I have for you there, Richard. On a personal level, what do you find? What gives you the biggest buzz? Is it seeing the plants that you know from back home, seeing them out in the wild, or is it going up, say, up into the high Alpine or the very tropical regions and seeing stuff that we'd have no chance of getting away with back home? Which one do you find more exhilarating?
I I suppose it's always, I'm always excited to see the things that we have growing back at home, out in the wild, and seeing how, you either get one or the other. They either look 10 times better in the wild, or they look 10 times worse. And sometimes it's quite reassuring when you see some plants in the wild that are, that we have growing back at home, and they make fantastic garden plants for us here. But out in the wild, they're straggly, horrible looking things. And sometimes that's very reassuring for us, in terms of cultivating them here. But you equally learn a lot from seeing, the things that struggle for us here. You see them out in the wild, and then you can understand, okay, well, I can understand why they're not doing so well for us here, because, we're trying to grow them in the wrong kind of position or whatever. But equally interesting is, seeing those very, very high alpines, for example, the things we could never attempt to grow here, there would be no chance of even, of cultivating those, some of them. And so getting a chance to see them is pretty special, because you're never going to see them anywhere else. And I suppose for me, seeing those things that are particularly rare, or in terms of conservation, those things that are endangered, that are really at risk of being lost in the wild, seeing those things is I think the most exciting thing for me, you know, and thankfully, you know, in conservation areas like this, they are well protected. I mentioned, you know, like there was an orchid there. I mentioned the Nepalese people collecting and using the tuber for food, the Paris polyphylla that's collected for medicine. Thankfully, those things don't happen so much anymore, with this area being a conservation area, but it is still ongoing in other places, and you know, so you're quite unlikely to see some of those things elsewhere.
Very good, very good. Just a couple of comments here in the chat bar. I see Carmel and Daly says, super, well done. Jane is complimenting you on your photos, saying they really brought the countryside to life. Simon Robinson here is saying after your talk, he's going out to get an Acer pectinatum soon, and he's wondering where he's left his hiking boots. Peggy Masterson is asking, were there many people living in the area, and how did they manage to get by in such a hostile environment?
So the biggest town that we went to was Ghunsa. That was just over 3,000 meters up in altitude. And I mean, that particular area is very is completely surrounded by mountains. It's very sheltered. I mean, they have severe winters, of course, but they yeah, they're there all year round. They survive pretty well. I mean, I found it quite interesting seeing their stores of food for the winter underneath a lot of their houses are on stilts, and they'll have yeah, sort of storage lower down. So they had tons and tons of potatoes actually stored for the winter, etc. The food is pretty basic, as you can imagine, but and in those areas, so between, you know, up to 4,000 meters, there's still plenty of woody plants. There's still plenty of trees. So the local people who live there are allowed to fell a number of trees a year. Otherwise, you know, to survive. So they use wood. But higher up, for example, when we got to Lonak, which is over 4,500 meters up, there's no trees. So there's no wood. There's nothing to burn apart from yak dung, which doesn't, as I said, doesn't kick out much heat in my experience. So to be honest, I'm not sure how those guys survive up there. Whether they come back down in the dead of winter, I wouldn't be surprised if they do, because it's pretty hostile up there. I mean, it was, yeah.
Imagine, yeah, it shows how adverse people can be living in such conditions. Raymond Fulton is asking, did you meet any other climbers when you were on your trek?
Yeah, we met 2 or 3 other people who were following the same route as us. We kept on bumping into each other along the way, kept on overtaking one another. And a couple of them were actually Nepalese hikers who had done a number of other trails. You know, they'd been to the Everest region before, Manaslu and all of these other mountains. And it was fascinating talking to them. The one lady actually said that this trek, the Kanchenjunga area, was one of the most difficult ones she's ever done, just because of how remote the area is and how long it takes to get from camp to camp, and the you know, the overall distance. So that made me feel better about the whole thing, because it's the first one I've done, and if it's the hardest one, then hopefully the others will feel a lot easier. But
I'm sure the rest will be a piece of cake after that one anyway.
But, yeah.
Yeah, so that's